Ever feel like everyone's got an opinion on something? Rent control is definitely one of those topics. It's been all over your research lately, and we're here to help you, sift through all the different takes.
It's interesting, how quickly people get fired up about this. I mean, housing is so important, so it makes sense, but sometimes, people have trouble seeing the nuances.
Totally. You've been diving deep into articles, online forums, all that, and it seems like there's a lot more to this rent control thing than meets the eye, maybe.
100%.
Yeah.
I think one of the biggest misconceptions out there is that it's just this simple renters versus landlords kind of thing.
Right, like it's some kind of boxing match and we got to pick a side.
Yeah.
But you're finding it's way more, complicated.
Way more, yeah. I mean, first of all, rent control as a term, right? It's not one size fits all. You've got strict rent freezes on one end, and then things like rent stabilization on the other, where increases are tied to inflation or whatever.
So it's like judging all rent control based on these like super old school versions would be like judging all of modern medicine based on practices from like 100 years ago.
Exactly. Like we've come a long way, right? Policy's always evolving.
Okay, so nuance is important here. Now, one of the biggest arguments you've seen is about how rent control affects the availability of housing. Basically, that it scares developers and then boom, fewer new apartments get built.
And it's really important to unpack why people think that. It's not coming from nowhere.
Makes sense. You mentioned some people were saying developers will just like take their money and build somewhere else if they don't like the rent control policies in a particular place. Which, I mean, if you think about it, like as a business, makes sense to maximize your profit.
Right. But it gets interesting because the impact of that disincentive, you know what I mean? It depends on what we're even talking about.
Because, I mean, take that city center example we saw. There's like practically nowhere to build anyway. Super limited land, zoning laws are strict. So even if you scared off every developer, would it even change much?
You got it. That's restricted supply, right? Building more isn't always the answer, especially in those super dense built-up areas. But even then,
rent control still has an effect, right, on the availability of rentals. And we're not even talking about new construction here.
Exactly. It's not just about how many apartments there are. It's about like how they move, within the market. Like how often do they even become available? This whole concept of turnover.
Okay. So like if I somehow manage to score a place with rent control, you're saying I'm going to be in no rush to move.
Right. I mean, why would you? Especially with how crazy market rates are these days.
Not a chance. I'd be like the rent-controlled apartment king. I'd never leave.
And there you go. And you staying put means one less apartment opens up for everyone else.
So it's like this chain reaction almost, not about new buildings, but about existing places becoming these like golden tickets everyone's holding onto for dear life.
and I think it was on Reddit. Someone had this perfect example. Their neighbor had a rent-controlled place, but get this, they bought a house. Guess what they were using the apartment for?
Okay, hold on. Let me guess. A home gym.
Yeah.
Or maybe they turned it into like a massive walk-in closet.
Storage. They literally just used it for storage.
Wow. Okay, that's something. But it does show how this whole turnover thing actually plays out, when you think about it.
Right. And understanding that helps us go beyond that rent control equals less housing idea,
Yeah.
There's a lot more to it.
All right, so even in places where building new housing isn't really an option, rent control still affects things. What else did you find in your research? What are some of the other factors?
Okay, so this brings up something that goes beyond just, the number of available units, right? What if, even with enough apartments for everyone, rent control leads to people living in places that just aren't a good fit for them, for their needs?
Oh, interesting. Okay, so it's not just about having a roof over your head, but whether that roof is, the right size or in the right location, something like that.
Exactly. It's like this mismatch between, who's living where and what would actually make more sense for them. Their lifestyle, their family size, all that. Economists call this misallocation.
Okay, I think I get it. It's like you're saying there's this mismatch, right, between who lives where and what actually makes sense for them at that point in their lives.
Exactly. Picture this, right? You got a family, been in their rent-controlled 3-bedroom, I don't know, maybe for years. Kids grow up, move out. Now it's just the parents rattling around in this huge place.
And you're saying at that point, downsizing makes sense. I mean, smaller place, probably cheaper.
Right, exactly.
Right.
But they got this amazing deal because of rent control. So even if a smaller place would make more sense for them now, staying put is just the better financial move. They'd be crazy to move.
It's like, I don't know, having that one comfy pair of sweatpants.
Yeah.
Right? Maybe not like stylish anymore, but they're familiar. They get the job done.
Perfect analogy. But here's the flip side, right? While they're in their comfy sweatpants, you've got another family, maybe with young kids, crammed into a tiny apartment they've totally outgrown. Desperate for more space, but moving. Forget about it. Not with these market rates.
Yeah, that's tough. And it really highlights how, I don't know, it's real people dealing with this, right? It's not just some theory. You said you actually saw some examples of this playing out in those Reddit discussions.
Oh yeah, tons.
Yeah.
One person was saying their friends, a family of 4, were all squeezed into a 1-bedroom. Couldn't afford to lose their rent control, Sharing a room, tensions are high.
Oof, that's rough. I can't even imagine. And I mean, it goes beyond just being cramped, right? Like, what if you're stuck miles away from work, from your kid's school, because moving closer means you lose your rent control and then you're stuck paying like an arm and a leg for rent?
Exactly. Longer commute, more expensive transportation. You might even have to turn down a better job, or your kid can't go to that school they got into because it's just too far.
It's like you try to solve one problem, but it's like you're creating all these others without even realizing it.
100%. And that's why, we got to zoom out a bit. Look at the big picture, all these unintended consequences.
Yeah. Okay, so speaking of bigger pictures, what about the landlords in all of this? A lot of people were concerned that rent control basically discourages them from investing in their properties, both building new places and even just maintaining the ones they have.
Yeah, and that's a valid concern. I mean, if landlords can't even charge market rates, why would they spend the money on making things nicer, doing repairs,
Right, because they're not going to see that return on their investment.
Right. But it might not be that simple. Somebody on Reddit made a really good point. They were saying that in these tight housing markets where rents are already going up like crazy, landlords might not have much incentive to do those improvements even without rent control.
Because they know they can rent them out anyway, right? As is.
Exactly. If people are desperate for housing and you got a waiting list a mile long, why bother?
Right. It's like that saying, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. But like in this case, it's more like, even if it is a little broke, we can still rent it.
Exactly. So you see, it's tricky. It's not so clear cut whether rent control is the only thing making landlords not want to invest.
So what about the landlords who do stick around, right? Even with rent control, are they just stuck making less money?
Not necessarily. Some people were talking about how some landlords will find other ways to make up for it, charge higher deposits, be super picky about who they rent to, or even just like ignore repair requests more.
So even if the rent's controlled, they're going to find other ways to like get that money, which could end up hurting tenants anyway.
It's definitely possible. And then there's the nuclear option, selling up, getting out of the rental market completely. And a lot of times they end up selling to people who are going to live there themselves, which means even fewer rentals on the market.
So now it's not even about the quality, it's about whether those rentals even exist.
That's the thing. It's like this whole ecosystem, who owns it, who gets to live there, and it's all connected. That's what makes it so hard to wrap your head around.
Definitely a lot to unpack.
Yeah.
So if rent control comes with all this baggage, what are the alternatives? What are some of the things people were suggesting?
Well, one thing that kept coming up was this idea that we need to fix the root causes of the housing crisis, not just the symptoms, Rent control is kind of like putting a Band-Aid on a broken bone. You got to look at the whole system.
Okay, yeah. So we're thinking bigger picture now, right? Not just rent control. Right,
it's got to be whole system kind of thing, right? Like, how's everything connected? Zoning, public housing, all those protections for renters, even like transportation infrastructure, all that stuff.
Right, because it is all connected. Like, it all affects the housing situation.
Totally. And, it's interesting because I saw this one thread. Someone was like, what if you could just magic wand, poof, there's enough affordable housing.
Like, just instantly problem solved.
Yeah, exactly. But then it's like, okay, even then, right? You got to think, what happens next?
Right, because we don't want to create even more problems.
Exactly. So it's like, okay, now what happens to those communities, the people already living there?
Yeah.
And what about all the strain on like schools, public services, all that?
It's like you almost have to think backward, right? Like, what do we actually want these communities to look like, and then figure out how to get there?
100%. And that means thinking about a bunch of different things, not just rent control, right?
Yeah.
We were talking about public housing before. Some people are like, yeah, let's build more. But then others are like, hold on, is that really the best use of resources?
Yeah.
What about all the bureaucracy?
Right, and then there's that whole thing about like, will it actually even be affordable, or are we just going to end up lining the pockets of developers?
Right. You got to be careful about that. And, it's not enough to just build those buildings, right? Like, what about maintenance? Are they in good locations where people can actually access jobs, transportation, all that good stuff?
It all matters. And that's where that whole community as a service thing is interesting, right? The idea that people treat a place like it's a service. Like, if it's convenient, they're there, and if it's not, they're gone.
Yeah, like a subscription you can cancel.
Exactly. So then it's like, how do we build that sense of community, right? Where people want to stay, put down roots, all that.
Right, because at the end of the day, we're not just talking about bricks and mortar or even just keeping costs down. This is about people's lives, right? It's about having a place where you can actually, build a good life for yourself and your family, connect with your neighbors, all that, man.
It's wild when you start to really think about it from all the different angles.
I know, right? But that's what's so great about these deep dives.
Right.
We get to go beyond the surface level, get everyone thinking a little deeper.
Exactly. So to everyone listening out there, hopefully this is giving you some stuff to think about, some new ways to approach this whole thing.
Yeah, and maybe even come up with some solutions yourselves.
Yeah.
Right? The more informed we all are, the better.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Yeah.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this. We talked about rent control and all its complexities. But imagine for a second if we could just snap our fingers and create a ton of affordable housing. What would that world look like? What new challenges and opportunities would pop up? How would it change things for communities? For all of us, really. Just something to think about. Till next time.